There were two young Argentinians in 1951. The first one was a biologist by the name of Alberto. The other person was Ernesto, a medical student. These two pals were organizing a very significant mission. With Alberto's ancient Norton 500 motorcycle, they intended to travel 8,000 kilometers across the southern continent of America in 4 months. They did this to celebrate Alberto's coming of age, since he would turn 30 in April 1952. In addition, they needed to satisfy their curiosity, so they set out on a journey across South America. The journey would start on January 4, 1952, in their hometown of Buenos Aires. Then they would proceed to Chile via Patagonia. They then traveled north to Peru before making their way to the Alps Machu Picchu. The Guajira Peninsula in Venezuela was their final stop. Alberto decided that they would travel between these routes, stopping at Miramar, so that Ernesto could see his sweetheart. It was finally January 4. Ernesto and Alberto departed Buenos Aires for their extensive journey. They were escorted by their family as they loaded the Norton 500 motorcycle with their things while packed on the sidewalk. In particular, Ernesto's family allowed him to embark on a journey to uncharted territory. Ernesto agreed with his mother's advice to always write home to let them know how they were doing, no matter where they were. Their ongoing journal of lengthy excursions and experiences was captured and preserved in this movie. They then began their journey. Even though they had fallen and tumbled into the ditch, the film depicted beautiful vistas of charming countryside not far from Buenos Aires. They traveled 601 kilometers and landed at Miramar on January 13, 1952. 9 days later, they had initially just intended to stay for 2 days. But in the end, they stayed in Miramar for a week, since Ernesto still desperately missed his sweetheart, especially considering how long it had been since they had last seen each other. They then departed Miramar. Ernesto had to part ways with his lover as well, and it was unclear when they would cross paths again. Chichina, Ernesto's girlfriend, was still hopeful that he would go back to Miramar. She therefore gave Ernesto some cash. Chichina begged Ernesto to get her a bikini made in the United States if he visits the country. The voyage of Alberto and Ernesto went on. These two young men traveled on this old motorbike across stunning scenery to appreciate Argentina's natural beauty. They had already begun to approach the mountainous area at that point. On January 29th, they reached Piedra del Aguila, after traveling 1,809 kilometers. Here, the wind was so severe that they lost their tent. As a result, they were compelled to spend the night in one of the inhabitants' homes, and share a warehouse with immigrants. Alberto made an effort to elucidate their medical training. They were still forced to sleep in the warehouse because the home's owner didn't care. After traveling 2,051 kilometers, they reached San Martin de los Andes on January 31st. They began to run out of money, so they used Alberto's language skills to search for free facilities. They were instructed to go catch their own fish in a lake after being flatly rejected. They had traveled 2,270 kilometers after 3 days. They were at Bariloche when Ernesto's asthma flared up again, so they had to halt there, so Ernesto could rest and get better. Because they actually needed it, Alberto brought up Chichina's money to pique Ernesto's interest in using it. But rather than spending Chichina's money, Ernesto was content to spend the night at the train station. Ernesto didn't want to go back on what he had told his girlfriend. The journey continued the following day, with Alberto operating the Norton 500 motorcycle by himself. Ernesto was allowed to nap on the rear seat. They ultimately succeeded in leaving Argentina's territory on February 15th. To get to the Chilean border, they boarded a boat and traveled through Patagonia's Lago Frias Lake. When they reached this location, their excitement grew once more. They encountered particularly difficult terrain in Chile's border region. Because of the heavy snowfall, their motorcycles' movement was slowed down by the treacherous snow that coated the roadways. They landed at Temuco, a small Chilean town, on February 18th. They pushed their motorcycle towards the city because it wouldn't start. Ernesto was still being bothered by Alberto over Chichina's money. Given their disorganized state, Alberto suggested to Ernesto that he spend the money. Ernesto, though, didn't want to pay attention to Alberto. Ernesto had a fierce sense of purpose. Once more, they were forced to spend the night at a train station. Two Argentinian doctors were traveling the world. According to local publications in the city the following day, Ernesto and Alberto requested that their ancient motorbike be serviced at a repair shop without charge. After reading the news in the newspaper, after first declining, the owner of the repair company felt extremely gratified and decided to take on the task of fixing the vintage Norton 500 motorcycle. After reading the article in the media, Alberto and Ernesto were also invited by the proprietor of the workshop to the later dance party. The dance party that night took place in a small space in a club. There were a lot of people in the room, and they all wanted to be entertained. Alberto, who loved to party, started to approach the girls and start dancing with them. Ernesto, who didn't particularly enjoy parties, nevertheless sat and kept his composure while sipping on a beverage. Ernesto was contacted by the workshop owner's wife, who had always been entranced by him. She observed her husband intoxicated at a bar table. She ventured to invite Ernesto to dance, since she knew that if her husband was intoxicated, he would undoubtedly pass out. Despite Ernesto's poor dancing skills, the two of them began to dance together. When this woman begged Ernesto to go, her husband's buddy interrupted them. Ernesto invited the woman to come out despite not knowing this, which ultimately caused a ruckus. People in the bar eventually started chazzing after Ernesto and Alberto. Fortunately, they were able to access the repair facility and retrieve their rebuilt motorcycle. Ernesto continued to operate the motorcycle as Alberto and Ernesto returned to the street. Instead, they struck the cows that were in the village streets at that time. As a result, their motorcycle broke down once more, forcing them to board a transport truck in order to continue traveling. They arrived in the Chilean city of Los Angeles on February 26. They had traveled 2,940 kilometers up to that point. They were then forced to resume pushing the damaged, ancient motorcycle. They observed two girls entering a cafe from the street. Ernesto and Alberto recognized a fantastic opportunity right away. They conversed with these two girls, who turned out to be sisters. After following them into the cafe, with a little deception, they might persuade the females to provide them lodging in addition to food and drink. It came out that the chief of the city's fire department was the father of these girls. The sympathetic fire chief greeted them and provided accommodations in the disorganized office. One of the firefighters learned that a doctor among these young people from Argentina. He therefore requested Ernesto's assistance in order to examine the state of an elderly woman in his hamlet. The elderly woman had been ill for a very long period without receiving medical attention. When Ernesto went to check on her, he discovered that the old woman's situation was really dire. Ernesto was unable to accomplish anything at the moment due to the elderly woman's health. Then, a fire station mechanic noticed the state of Alberto's outdated Norton motorcycle. He said that this Norton 500 motorcycle was no longer capable of intercontinental travel. The mechanic made him an affordable offer to buy the motorcycle. Finally, Alberto had to let go of his beloved motorcycle. They were now forced to continue traveling on foot. They also received a free lift from a truck, and on March 7, 1952, they finally arrived in Valparaiso, a stunning seaside resort that served as a major source of inspiration for Chile's famed poet Pablo Neruda. They verified the telegram from Chichina in this city, and discovered that Ernesto had received a letter. Alberto seized the envelope right away since it contained cash. Ernesto was upset over another letter, but he refrained from saying why. It appeared that Chichina requested a pause. Following that, they resumed their adventure across Chile's Atacama Desert on foot. It occurred on March 11th, and represented the 4,960th mile. They came into contact with a young couple who were on their way to a quarry to look for work. Together, they all spent the night on the desert. This couple told Ernesto and Alberto about how they were compelled to flee their home after authoritarian officials forcibly took their land ownership rights. The narrative then went on to describe their families, who were similarly wronged by the Chilean government. Ernesto saw how these weak people were treated arbitrarily by the miners the following day at the Chuquicamata mine. Ernesto was enraged to witness what transpired. However, they proceeded on their trek and are now in Peru's Andes Mountains. As a result of the pressure from the arbitrary authorities, they encountered unfairness and a growing sense of helplessness as they traveled farther into Peru, that the inhabitants lacked a home on private property. Alberto and Ernesto reached Cuzco, Peru, on April 2, 1952, after traveling 6,932 kilometers. Cuzco was regarded as the geographic center of North America. This ancient settlement was built by the highly advanced Incas. Here, they were able to observe the native tribes' fine culture and excellent intellectual caliber. But regrettably, there were now people living there who had very little formal education, particularly after these two young guys reached the Inca fortress at the peak of the Andes Mountains, Machu Picchu. They became more and more aware of the Incas' superior culture and intelligence. They seem to have had a basic understanding of mathematics and astronomy in antiquity, and as a result of Spanish colonization, they are currently a downtrodden and unappreciated group. Ernesto and Alberto then considered starting a revolution to transform South America into a better region with greater equality and fairness. They then continued on their trek to Lima, Peru's capital. They had plans to visit Dr. Hugo Pesce's home. He was the director of a specialized leprosy hospital, and Alberto had earlier called him and informed him that they would pay him a visit. This doctor was incredibly compassionate. He provided them with housing, clothing, and pocket money. Additionally, he suggested a peasant revolution. Alberto and Ernesto were brought to Dr. Hugo Pesce's hospital, where they were both given accommodations. Hugo Pesce, the hospital's medical director, treated patients who had leprosy's early symptoms. The Amazon River's banks city of San Pablo received the more serious instances. Ernesto and Alberto then made the decision to travel to San Pablo, which would require taking a small boat from Pucallpa for 5 days. On June 5, 1952, they landed in San Pablo after traveling 10,223 kilometers. When they arrived in San Pablo, they were greeted by Dr. Brichini, who immediately urged them to explore the area and take a look at the amenities. Alberto and Ernesto would perform this labor voluntarily. They were then led to the area where individuals with advanced leprosy received treatment. The Amazon River divided it from the main facility location across which it was located. There were about 600 Latin American leprosy colonies in this separate area. Protective gloves were provided for Ernesto and Alberto to wear at the scene. But after learning from Dr. Brichini that leprosy is truly not contagious if the patient is on medicine, they declined. They finally crossed the river to the opposite side. The leper patients were startled to see Ernesto and Alberto without rubber gloves, and they even shook their hands and engage in normal conversation. However, that infuriated the facility's head, a nun. The two foreigners were thought to have broken the regulations, which incensed the facility's manager. They were then given permission to explore the area, which resembled a brand new village. The inhabitants of this place were indeed trained to begin a new life. Together, the villagers of this village constructed their own homes. As a result of their acute leprosy, many of them had to have their arms amputated. There was a patient there who required surgery to have her hand severed at the moment. Sylvia, the patient, however, declined. Ernesto made an effort to convince the patient by talking about his experiences with asthma, which ultimately won the patient over. Alberto and Ernesto spent some of that dismal afternoon in their room. Alberto announced that he has been approved by Dr. Brichini to join the leprosy hospital's permanent medical staff in Caracas, Venezuela. Ernesto witnessed the plight of the defenseless people who suffered as a result of the numerous injustices that took place throughout their journey. Ernesto became more fearful as a result of his interactions with the residents of San Pablo. Finally, Sylvia decided to have her hand operated on, and Ernesto remained by her side as she recovered. Other patients were diligently given humane care by Ernesto. Ernesto established human equality between nurses and patients. Furthermore, Ernesto and Alberto interacted with the locals as well. Together, they built houses for people while simultaneously singing, playing ball, and working together. Alberto and Ernesto weren't granted food rations one day since they skipped the church's mass procession. They both objected. They immediately rushed to the kitchen to request food. However, because the rules needed to be upheld, their request was denied. They eventually found themselves sitting outside with their stomachs growling. But soon after, the villagers including Sylvia flocked to them and fed them out of sympathy for Alberto and Ernesto's presence in the community. They are both regarded as having great quality. Alberto had gotten a letter of acceptance from the hospital in Caracas that evening, and it appeared that he would take it in order to begin a new life in his 30s. Then, as one of the places for employee amusement, they hosted a dance party one evening. Alberto started dancing right away to the mambo music. Ernesto did nothing but sit and observe the commotion in the space as usual. And Ernesto's birthday fell on that day. Employees of the medical facility celebrating this future doctor's birthday. Dr. Brishini has also arranged a houseboat as a gift for Ernesto and Alberto, who will continue their journey tomorrow, so they can safely cross the Amazon River to the Colombian border. Ernesto expressed his gratitude for the celebration, and made an appeal for unity among Americans, to which the whole medical personnel present saluted him. The celebration then went on, but Ernesto was still thinking about the individuals on the opposing side. He wanted to celebrate his birthday with them as well. However, Ernesto fearlessly jumped over the broad Amazon River when he realized there was no boat. Alberto was powerless to stop it, and could do nothing except scream hysterically, which attracted the attention of everyone in the party room. The medical staff screams, especially those of Dr. Brishini, who pleaded with Ernesto to stop his careless behavior, ultimately attracted the attention of the peasants on the opposite side. Ernesto felt more ecstatic after hearing the screaming and disregarded his asthma. He persisted in swimming against the rapid river current, till he finally reached the opposite side of the settlement. He was then welcomed by the villagers and brought inside a chamber. The day of departure arrived that morning. Ernesto was taken up by Alberto and Dr. Brishini on a houseboat. Everyone was really impressed by the two of them during the 3 weeks, and let them go. After hugging Dr. Brishini, whom they regarded as a compassionate savior, they also let go of the boat's anchor. While they were at the San Pablo leper colony, he had provided for them. They traversed the Amazon River for several days. They arrived at the border with Colombia on June 22, 1952. In Caracas, Venezuela, on July 26, 1952, these two friends were forced to separate ways. Alberto chose not to go back to Buenos Aires, because he had been hired as a full-time employee in this city. In order to one day hire Ernesto, Alberto hoped that he would return home and complete his studies to become a doctor. But Ernesto was even more perplexed and doubtful that it would actually happen. His heart had been very full after his recent excursion. He witnessed how powerless mankind was in the face of the injustice. Ernesto's heart was moved to transform into a different person. He is not who he once was, because the jet needed to take off right away. Alberto let his companion leave. They didn't run into each other again for 8 years, even in real life. Alberto was encouraged to move to Havana by Ernesto, who at the time was already known as Che Guevara, to assist in the construction of educational institutions for the Cuban people. And up until the end of his life, Alberto kept teaching to enhance the educational system in Cuba. He devoted the entirety of his creative output to Che Guevara, the revolutionary leader of Cuba, who had left him first. Subscribe for more content like this. Don't forget to turn on notifications and leave a like to support the channel. Thank you for watching.